Welcome back again. In this lesson, we will work on custom cells in collection views. And even though they are very similar to the ones in table views, I wanted to show you this because throughout this process, I want to show you some other features of collection views as well. This time, I won't be using a controller. I will be using a view itself. So let's go into Xcode. And here I'm going to start a new application. I'm going to call it custom cells in, not cells, cells in collection views. And in here, I'm going to head into my storyboard. And unlike the last time that we deleted the view controller and we made a collection view, this time I'm not going to do any of those things. I'm just going to go in here and say, I want a collection view. So I'm going to add a new collection view, just like how when we were adding a table views to view controllers. And here I'm going to place it somewhere. And you probably want to set the constraints for it as well. So I'm going to say add the missing constraints. And I'm going to make my background view to be maybe a light gray so I can actually see the collection view more vividly. So this is my collection view now. Now, since I have it like that, I have to make an outlet for it. So I'm going to go into my assistant window. And in here, I'm going to go ahead and say this is my collection view. So that part is taken care of. And the next thing that I wanted to do is I wanted to have a custom class for this cell. So to do that, I'm going to come back in here and say I have a new file. This new file is going to be of the type UI collection view cell. And I'm going to call it my collection view cell. So now that we have that file, I'm going to go ahead back into my storyboard and say this cell is actually using my collection view cell as its class, and now they're connected to each other. So I can head into the assistant window, load the right file, which is going to be this one, and say this cell is now going to have its different outlets introduced in here, just like how we had done it in a table view. So for instance, what I want to have is this. I want to have an image view within my collection view cell. So right in here, and I'm going to place it to be right on 10, 10, 10, and 10. So somewhere in the middle exactly. And I'm going to say this is going to be my IMG view. So it's the image view of the collection view cell. And now that's taken care of. And the last thing I want to do is I want to say my collection view cell has an identifier. The identifier is cell ID. So that part is taken care of. Let's head back into our view controller where we have to do a lot of things now. And the first thing we have to do is our view controller is conforming to UI view controller, but we also need to conform to UI collection view delegate as well as UI collection view data source. Because now this view controller is both the delegation and the data source for my collection view, which is this one. So let's go in here and say we need to add two methods in here. One of those methods is going to be the cell for item at. So cell for item at. So that's one of them, the important one. And then the other one is going to be number of items in section. Of course, we could use the other delegation and data source methods, but these two are the ones we absolutely need them. And for this, I'm going to go ahead and say the number of items and the number of the content of it has to be informed this time not by a static number, rather by an actual array of images. So I have an array of images that you can use, or you could just add your own array of images. There are 6 images in here. I'm going to add them all in here. So I have 6 images, and I'm going to copy all of their names, go in here into at the top of my view controller essentially, and put all of them inside an array. So I'm going to say let images array to be all of these guys. And we have to obviously close them properly so they are known to be string values. So I've got that, and then this, and then that, and then that, and then that. So I have an array with 6 images in it, and I'm going to format it properly. And then I'm going to say the number of items is return my images array dot count. And then for the cell at row, we have to introduce a new cell. So that cell, I'm going to say let cell to be collection view dot dequeue using the identifier is cell ID, just like the last time. Index path is index path, but our cell is not going to be of the type UI collection view cell anymore. It's now going to be of the type that we called M collection view cell. So I'm going to go in here and say, let's do this as this type, my collection view cell. And of course we have to return it so we take care of that error. Now, in the meantime, between when we introduce it and when we return it, we can do things such as this one. Say cell dot image view or my image view dot image becomes a UI image, and that image is named, and the name is from images array index path dot row. So we find the right image from the array, we place it into the name of a UI image object, and we put that in the image of the image view of our cell. So now everything is set up except for the fact that our collection view, which is called my collection view here, doesn't know where the data source and delegate are coming from. So I'm going to go ahead into my view did load and say after the super view did load, I'm going to say dot delegate is self and dot data source is once again self. And if we run our application now, we should be able to see some cells showing up in our collection view, even though their flow and their layout is not done properly yet. So that's the next thing that we have to be doing. We have to make sure that all of these cells are essentially placed in the way that we want them to be. And to do that, we could either do what we did in the last lesson, which is using the delegate methods, or we could do a different approach this time. And this time I'm going to choose a new approach. And in this new approach, I'm going to say let my layout to be, let's be of a UI collection view flow layout. So this is my new layout, and I'm going to apply this to my collection view dot collection view layout. So that becomes my layout, and then I'm going to set everything in between. So I'm going to say my layout dot item size is something that we have to decide about. Then I have my layout, then I have to set the section inset, just like the last time. I have to decide about my layout dot interim spacing, and then I have to decide about my layout dot line spacing, just like what we had done the last time. The line spacing is very simple, is 0. We know it. The interim spacing is 0. The section inset is UI edge inset dot 0. So that's also easy. The item size, just like the last time, we actually have to calculate it. So to calculate that, I'm going to go in here and say let items pair to be, let's say last time it was 3, this time let's make it 5. So I have 5 items pair, or let's make it 2 because we only have 6 items. So let's say items pair are 2. And based on that, I'm going to go ahead and say let cell width to become self.myCollectionView.boundaries.width. Let's divide that by the CG float of items pair. So now we find the width of each of the cells because we get the total width, we divide it by how many are there, and I'm going to say this becomes a CG size of, let's say the same values, same width and the same value of the width for the height. Now, the last thing that you have to do, and in this case it probably doesn't make much of difference, but you have to be careful about it, is that your collection view is not necessarily laid out in the view did load. So that actually happens in the view did appear. We could put a lot of this code in the view did appear, but that's really not something that I'm a very big fan of it. Instead, here's what I'm suggesting to do. We could say right before we do this little calculation, because that's the part that gets affected by the size of the view. I'm going to say right before that, do self.view.layout if needed. So if you need to lay it out, if the size of the view is different than the size of the device, do that, lay it out, then calculate this size. Because once the view is laid out, we will have the right size for the width, and based on that, you could actually calculate this size, the item size. Now we can run this application now, and we should be able to see the cells that are 2 of them on each line, or essentially on each row, and they should have no spaces between them. And that's exactly what's happening in here. The gaps that you see in here are not between the cells. These are the gaps that each image view has against the cell itself. Let me show you that really quickly so we know where that's happening from. This is that gap. There is an image view, and then there is a cell, and we have a constraint for 5 units. I could in fact do this one for you. I could go into my view controller and say, when we are making the cells, make the cell dot background color to become UI color dot cyan, for instance. And if we run this, we'll see that the cyan backgrounds are perfectly adjacent to each other, but the image views, they have a little margin from each side. So this was how we use a collection view cell when the cell is actually designed within the collection view itself. There is another situation that happens quite often, and that is when you want to share a cell between different collection views. So I'm going to show you how we do that one really quickly. I'm going to start a new file. In this new file, which is again of the type UI collection view cell, I'm going to call it my cell, for instance. And I'm going to say also create the XIB file, or you could do that separately, doesn't matter. So once I make it, it's going to go ahead and make 2 files for me. One of them is the cell Swift, and the other one is the cell XIB. Now, if I go to the XIB file, the important one, so here is the cell in a separate XIB file, and the class for it is my cell. So they are interconnected to each other. Now I could go ahead and say this cell actually has an object in it, maybe a label, all right? And I place it right up there, something like that. And I'm going to go ahead and say make the constraints just like the last time, 5 units from all angles, and then make it align to the center, maybe a little bit larger, and it has a different background. And now I'm going to go into my cell and say I have an outlet for it, and that outlet is this. So is that IB outlet variable, let's call it my label, which is of the type UI label. And if I head back to my XIB file now, I should be able to select my cell, and out there in the connections, see my label. And I'm going to connect it to my label. And I'm also going to go ahead and give an ID to my cell. So here the ID for it, I'm going to say it's my cell ID. So we have 2 cells so far. One of them is within the storyboard, within the collection view. The other one is outside in an XIB file and is standing alone. Now, this one is not connected to any particular collection view just yet. So to fix that, I'm going to go to my view controller. In my view did load, just like what we did in a table view, I'm going to say my collection view dot register, and I want to register using a nib and using an identifier. So not that actually, I want to register using a nib and an identifier. So that one. So I'm going to go ahead and say UI nib, and that nib is actually from a string, and the string for it is called my cell. So it's going to be my cell, and then the bundle for it is nil because it is within the same bundle, and the identifier for it is my cell ID. That's the identifier we put for the cell. So now my collection view can use this kind of cell. If it can, it doesn't mean it's going to use it. So we could actually change that. I'm going to go in here in my collection view, cell for item, and I'm going to say, let's do this. If the index path is even, let's use the image. If they are odd, let's use the label. So to do that, here's what we have to do. We have to run an if-else statement, and here's where it becomes a little bit tricky. So I could go ahead and say if index path dot row modulus 2 is 0, then we have to do something else. We have obviously to do something else. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and say if it is even, you want to use the image. So this part is easy. Let's take that. And I'm going to place it there. Then I'm going to copy the whole thing and I'm going to paste it in here and say, if it is the else, if it is odd, let's do this. Let me delete these so I can show you everything in one screen. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and say, if it is an odd one, let cell to be collection view with my cell ID, and then go ahead in here and say it is of the type my cell, and my cell doesn't have an image view anymore, rather it has this. It has a label built into it. Dot text becomes, let's say it becomes the value of the index path. So index path dot row. Now this seems to be working, but then when we are trying to return the cell, both of these cells are actually declared within if else bodies. So really this one doesn't know where cell is. So the scope of it is actually different. And that's where it becomes a little bit tricky, because you could do one of these two things. You could say, well, I'm going to bring the cell out of this scope. So put it in here and then drop that. Obviously, this is not going to work now because cell doesn't know what kind of cell it is. You could say, well, I'm going to make it of the M collection cell. So something like that. But then the problem is this very same cell should be used in here as well. So both if and else, they have to use the same cell, but one of them is of the type M collection view cell. One of them is of the type my cell, and that's really not going to work. Now here is the advantage of essentially inheritance, a topic that we discussed many sections ago. So when I declare my cell, I'm going to say it is of the type UI collection view cell. Since both M collection view cell and my cell, they're both subclasses of UI collection view cell, they're kind of interchangeable. So it is true that the cell is declared of the type UI collection view cell, but for the even numbers, it is being defined or implemented as an M collection view cell, and for the odd ones, is being implemented as a different type of cell. Now, when you are trying to put the image view, or the label is saying, well, I don't know if the UI collection view cell has anything like that, because that is how you have declared it for me. And what you have to do, you have to say, well, cell in here is as M collection view cell. I know that for sure to be true. And then in here, I'm going to go ahead and say cell as, this time is going to be my cell, and this time my label.text. So even though cell has been declared of a different type, it is being defined as two other different ways, both of them subclasses of the original type. And now if we run this application, in some of the cells we should see the images, in some other cells we should see the numbers of the index paths, and index path rows essentially. And that's exactly what we were hoping to see. And now we have two custom cells that they appear here based on some sort of a condition, and they're both of the same type, even though their definitions are quite different. And that is how to use custom cells, as well as how to use a collection view layout instead of using the collection view flow layout delegate. And let's keep it up to here, and let's move on to our next lesson.